Thank you so much. The wine was also good tonight, so appreciate that. I sat down over here and I picked up the program and it said Luther 101, and I thought, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. I used to teach Western Civ and I included the Reformation, but I wasn't ready to talk about that tonight. So it looks like next month is very good, quite appropriate. This is my second time here. I was here 5 years ago. Thanks to the Vermont Humanities Council. I've been doing this now. I've been to a lot of Vermont towns, Rutland, Middlebury, St. James, as I think they call it, as opposed to St. Johnsbury, and Norwich, I think was the last one. So I must be coming full circle because I'm back at the first place I started here on a very snowy evening in January. I'm delighted to talk about this subject. It's something that's been on my mind for quite some time. I published an article on it several years ago in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. I brought that issue because there's a little bit I want to read from that. Okay, the Voyage of the St. Louis. You'll notice with my title that I have refugee also in quotation marks because we didn't have a refugee policy. And most countries don't have a refugee policy. You couldn't go to the Federal Republic of Germany today and ask for the refugee policy that allowed basically 1 million Syrians into the country in 2015. It doesn't exist. This was a decision that was made by Angela Merkel. It was a decision that was made at the time. People that came into our country were actually coming in as immigrants. We had an immigration policy, which I think most countries do. This is going to be, hopefully this will start to clear itself up here soon. So that's the reason. I think it's important to understand that. After I published on the St. Louis, when I was at the museum, I actually began by looking at the St. Louis, but then was drawn very much to something called the Wagner-Rogers Bill. This was an effort to bring 20,000 German refugee children into the country in 1939 and 1940. Obviously, it was a plan that was put in place in early '39 before the war broke out, so you're thinking ahead to 1940 without realizing that there's going to be a war. Always important to remind ourselves that none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. But that doesn't pass. And it doesn't pass because we had a quota system that not only were people quite wedded to, but so many congressmen, and in fact so much of our population thought it was far too generous, that it needed to be cut dramatically, and there were in fact senators and congressmen that were talking about cutting it entirely for 5 years until we were absolutely assured that we were out of the Great Depression. And then we could let it kick back in. Now, that's an excuse, obviously, and those kinds of excuses remain with us today. But I want to talk about the St. Louis and hopefully give you some background that you might not be that familiar with that I feel is important. Get this thing to go. Okay, the basic parameters of what we're talking about here is there was a German ship, and some of you read the information on the photographs that are at the library, and I like to reinforce how valuable that exhibit is over there. Go take a look at it. I think just from that, I think you'll learn a great deal about the voyage of the St. Louis. May 13th, 1939. A ship that has 937 passengers on it leaves Hamburg. Actually, that deserves just a minor footnote because roughly 30 of those passengers were actually picked up in Cherbourg on the 15th of May. That's a piece that just muddies the water a little bit. I don't need to tell you that, but I like to be accurate, you know. So it leaves on the 13th from Hamburg. It's heading for Cuba, for Havana, Cuba. On this ship, not all of them are Jews, but the great majority are. On the ship are 4 Spaniards and 2 Cubans who are not Jewish, and the remaining passengers are all Jewish. 22 of those Jewish passengers paid the $500 that was needed to get a visa that allows them to get off the ship. And in fact, those 22 passengers do disembark when the ship gets to Havana. And of course, the Spaniards and the Cubans get off as well. The others had purchased something called a tourist landing permit. And the tourist landing permit was supposed to allow them to get off the ship and to remain. They weren't tourists, everybody knew that. But there was a guy that was making a bundle of money by selling tourist landing permits. And it would allow them to get off the ship and remain in Cuba until such time as their quota numbers matured. Some of them had quota numbers that would mature in the next couple of months, meaning at that point they would be able to come to the United States, not as refugees, but as immigrants. Others had quota numbers that would not mature for 2 or more years, and so they would be remaining in Cuba for that amount of time. So the ship set sail, 237 passengers, on the 24th of May, a message comes from the Joint Refugee Committee. The Joint Distribution Committee, which is located in New York City, it's the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, very often referred to simply as the Joint. It has refugee committees in any number of countries throughout the world who coordinate issues dealing with Jewish refugees in those particular places. The Joint Refugee Committee in Havana contacted the ship, letting them know that they're having problems and there's a possibility that the ship will not be able to disembark its passengers when it gets in. Up to that moment, these 900 plus passengers had felt fairly confident that everything was going to be okay. They knew people that were already in Havana at this point, and so they felt relatively assured. In fact, over the last several months, more than 2,000 German Jews had come to Cuba. So this was not unusual to do this. And as with them, many of these people intended eventually to come to the United States, again, once their quota number came up. 24th, Gustav Schroeder, who was the captain, he receives this word. He is startled, he's upset by this. Schroeder was a very good man. And he decides to select a committee of passengers, 5 individuals, and share this information with them. He said there's no certainty here, but there seems to be a problem and there's a possibility that the passengers will not be able to disembark. The Hamburg America line said, why don't you continue? It's the 24th. The ship has mostly finished the voyage by this point. They're going to, in fact, arrive in Havana Harbor on the 27th. We're only 3 days from Havana. Let's see what happens. And so the ship arrives early in the morning on the 27th. This was a leisurely cruise. You know, they left on the 13th of May. It doesn't take that many days to cross the ocean. It takes 5 or 6 days. So this was, and this is a very good ship. So this was a leisurely cruise. These people are beside themselves. They're happy that they're going to Cuba. And so they arrive, and the decision has been made by the president, Laredo Bru, that they're not going to be able to disembark. So they're not even allowed to come to the Hamburg American Pier. So they have to anchor in Havana Harbor. And that's when these negotiations then begin. 734 of these passengers, the great majority of them, hold quota numbers. The others, What they intended to do, I can't tell you. If they planned on maybe staying in Cuba, there had been German Jews coming to Cuba. There's a fairly significant Jewish community in Cuba that had started to build up since the 1920s. So it was not unusual to find Jews in Cuba at this time. I told you about those who disembark, but a piece of information, you probably are all aware of this. In the 1920s, Warren G. Harding, beginning with Harding, then going to Calvin Coolidge, and then certainly embraced as well by Herbert Hoover, is a quota system. This belief that we have accepted far too many immigrants in this country, and immigrants not of the right sort. This was a time when people were worried about Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans, and this was a time when the concept of eugenics was running wild in our country, and we had this sense that some people were superior and some were inferior, and we were damaging the racial stock. Beginning in the 1890s, there was a group called the Immigration Restriction League, which Henry Cabot Lodge was very much involved with, as were a number of very significant Harvard graduates, all kind of Boston Brahmins, and they were attempting and had been attempting over several administrations, actually beginning with Grover Cleveland, working their way all the way through the Wilson administration to limit immigration. When the Democrats lose the White House, this then becomes something that happens beginning in 1920 with an emergency quota bill that then becomes a more formal quota bill in 1921, and then in 1924 there are two bills that are kind of combined with each other that take effect over the next few years. And the quota that ultimately comes out of this Actually, it allows 25,900 and something Germans, but by the time that the St. Louis sales, something that is called the Anschluss, which I trust many of you know of, has occurred. Austria has been joined with Germany as of March of 1938. And so Roosevelt said we need to combine the Austrian quota with the German quota. And so it jumps a bit higher than it had been because the Austrian quota was something over 1,000. The quota is based on the number of immigrants at a certain point in our history, the size of the population rather, at a certain point in our history based on their ethnicity. And ironically, something that a lot of people don't realize is that by 1920, there were actually more Germans, more people of German heritage than there were of English heritage in our country. But they did something that was rather tricky. They, and I think rather cynical too, they based one's ethnicity, they decided, on one's surname. And so many Germans had anglicized their surnames that they were treated as English immigrants as opposed to German immigrants. And this caused a dramatic drop in the quota for Germany, although Germany still has the second largest quota based on the quota system. So in any case, the number I give you here is out of a quota system that was developed in the 1920s. The total quota, and this is just for Europeans, it's just for Europeans. We were open to people in the Western Hemisphere. Largely, I would suggest, because not many came. So that was easy. But of course, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act from the 1880s, which meant that no Chinese could get over here, except there was a slight bit of wiggle room that allowed them to get in. To the country, but then that was extended to virtually all of Asia in the 1920s. So you're looking at something that is a product of the 1920s largely. This is not something that the Roosevelt administration developed. It's something that the Roosevelt administration is living with at this point, with very little possibility of changing it. Okay. One of the arguments I have with the Holocaust Museum, and they're aware of this because they know of my research, and they're trying subtly to make little changes in the exhibit they have there. If you've been to the Holocaust Museum in DC, you know that there's a very large wall that's devoted to the St. Louis. And my complaint is it treats it as if it was the only ship that ever crossed the ocean in 1939 with Jews on board. And I think that that is unfair because, in fact, in 1939, we actually reached the quota that year, 27,370. In fact, we went a little beyond it in 39, and beginning in 38, the number of immigrants from Germany coming over had gone up fairly significantly, and of course in 39 the war breaks out, and that adds a complication to get in this country. But in the research, I went through getting information on how many are coming over. And so you have this article from May of 1939, letting you know how many have come into the country at this point. Obviously not people on the St. Louis. By the way, there was another ship, there was another sailing of the St. Louis in February that makes the New York Times. The St. Louis didn't just come across the ocean once. You know, when we talk about the sailing of the St. Louis, it wasn't just in May, June of 1939. It makes the front page of the New York Times because it hits a horrific storm in the Atlantic. And when it finally gets, several days late, when it gets into New York, the issue is that this ship has finally arrived in New York, and kind of as a sub-issue, and there were 22 German Jews on board, something like that. But the ship was coming, and it wasn't just going to Havana, it was going to other places, such as New York. Later the same year, there is other information indicating how many have come over by after the first 3 months or the first 9 months of the year. You can see that 16,730 Jews had come to the United States at that particular point. Now the war has begun by then. So it's obviously by the end of the year it's becoming more difficult. Although there was a ship that actually had more Jews on it than the St. Louis called the Rotterdam that arrives on the 2nd of December 1939. What I found interesting about that, because I got a hold of the ship's manifest, is that one of the people on that ship had been on the St. Louis, but now she came over because her quota number had matured. Johanna Jordan was her name. So why Cuba? Why did they come to Cuba? How does this make any sense? There's a ship called the SS Orinoco. It had Jews on board, and it was sailing for Mexico, and the Mexican government refused them to disembark in Mexico. And a man who doesn't have the best of reputation with us, he was the last leader of Cuba before Fidel Castro, Colonel Batista, who some of you probably remember the name Batista. He got involved with this, and he had these people come to Cuba. I think he's nurturing his relationship at this point with the United States, but you know, for whatever reason, whether it's humanitarian or his own, you know, getting self-praise or whatever it might be, this happens. Later the same month, he goes to New York and he meets with representatives of the National Coordinating Committee, which is coordinating Jews coming into the country, and the Joint Distribution Committee. He meets in New York at a hotel with them, and he makes this statement to Lawrence Berenson that Cuba will cooperate in providing a haven for refugees, and he bases it on, of all things, which is kind of fascinating, the Avian Conference. Now, those of you who have studied the lead up to the war and the Holocaust at all know that the Avian Conference does not have a very good reputation, doesn't have a good press. Here is Batista saying that he recognizes Thank you. That he recognizes the effort that Roosevelt had put out to try to deal with the refugee crisis, the Jewish crisis in Europe. And so Cuba is going to assist in this. And he makes this agreement with Lawrence Berenson, very important for our story here, saying that Cuba's going to cooperate. Cuba's going to cooperate. And so what you have then is, by the time the St. Louis sails, there are roughly 6,000 Jews living in Cuba at that time, and approximately 2,000 of those have arrived since the beginning of 1939, largely as a result of Colonel Batista's agreement with Lawrence Berenson, with the Joint Distribution Committee, and with the NCC. And so Cuba made sense. Cuba made sense. I mean, this is a piece of the story that I think is too often missed. A lot of people look back at the Avian Conference and say, well, the Dominican Republic was the only one that said, you know, we'll take some in. Well, they did take some in, a tiny number, and it was late in the game. And they threw up barriers against Jewish refugees. They did take some in, but there were problems associated with that. Very few people know that Cuba took in quite a few more than the Dominican Republic does. And so this is a logical place for German Jews to come, waiting until such time as their quota numbers mature and they can move on. So the ship comes into harbor. At the point when it becomes clear, this is the 27th of May, that they're not going to be able to disembark, word goes out to New York City. The Joint Distribution Committee and the National Coordinating Committee have an emergency meeting, and they decide to send Lawrence Berenson and Celia Rosofsky down to Cuba. These are two individuals who have been involved in one way or another with Jewish refugees. Berenson obviously has had this relationship with Batista. Berenson goes down very cocky. I've read a letter that he wrote to a friend of his in the State Department saying, basically, I'm not going to be available. I need to go to Cuba. I need to iron out this problem. The president of Cuba is very upset with the Hamburg American shipping line, and I need to clear things up. He's convinced that he's going to be able to do this, and he goes down with that kind of optimism. It turns out to be too optimistic. Celia Rosofsky goes with him, and her role is to communicate with the people on board. And not just with the people on board, but then with the people that are anticipating that they're going to get off the ship, either in the United States or friends that they have or relatives that they already have on shore in Cuba itself. So the ship sits here. It's in harbor from the 27th of May until the 2nd of June. That's better than a week. It sits there. And the reason that it's there so long is these negotiations are going on. Lawrence Berenson meets with Laredo Brew. Laredo Brew at one point says they're not going to be allowed here. The next point he says, yes, but we need to have certain guarantees. And the story keeps changing. And this doesn't happen just once. There's not just one cycle like this. It happens a couple of times. Part of the reason that this is happening is because so many Jews have arrived since the beginning of the year that there's been an upsurge of anti-Semitism in Cuba, which they hadn't had before. Most of these Jews are staying in Havana. Most of these Jews do not work in agriculture. They have business, they have financial backgrounds, they ran shops, and this is very troubling to Cubans because now Cuba doesn't experience the Depression as much as the United States, to be sure, but the economy is still on a downturn here. This is still not, why are we accepting all of these people? I mean, we all know the story. Why are we accepting these people when we have our own people out of work? It's not right to do that. And to make matters worse, Germany had actually infiltrated some Nazi agents into Cuba. who were working either at the Hamburg American Shipping Line office or at the Bayer Chemical Company. Bayer aspirin is something that originated in Germany, you need to note. And they're kind of filtering out information that starts to get published. So there is a rise of anti-Semitism. A bigger issue is, let me see, a bigger issue is Batista has put in place a person who is very close to him, the man named Manuel Benitez, who is the Director General of Immigration. He's kind of a toady of Batista. Batista, keep in mind, he's a military officer. It's very difficult to understand what kind of government Cuba has at this point. Batista has already made sure he has removed a president a few years before. And it was not a happy removal. It was rather a bloody removal. Benitez worked for him. They're both colonels, but you know, this is like Colonel Gaddafi. Colonel is you think that you know somebody's got to be a five-star general to be a leader, but colonel seems to be high enough in certain countries. Okay, but in any case, they're both. But Benitez is clearly the junior to Batista. Batista puts him, he's a loyal man, he puts him in this position. And he decides to use the tragedy of Jews to make a profit. And in fact, he makes a huge profit. And not just him, but the Hamburg America Shipping Line does too. He sells these tourist landing permits for basically $160 each. And the money doesn't go to the government, it goes to him, okay? Or it goes to the Hamburg American Shipping Line. So both are making a big profit off of the misery of Jews who are trying to get out of Germany at this point. Well, this becomes known to people in the government, and they get pretty upset. They're either upset because they're not in on the game, or they're upset by the corruption. You know, you could go either way on this. But the beginning of the month, like the 4th or the 5th, Laredo Bru, the president, he passes basically an executive action stating that you cannot come to Cuba unless you get a visa, and that visa has to have the signature of both the Secretary of Labor and the Secretary of Commerce on it. This goes into effect on the 6th. It's published on the 6th. Benitez immediately writes a letter to the shipping lines saying, you need to be aware of this, that you cannot be bringing people over to the country now unless you get this sort of permission. However, if somebody has a tourist landing permit that they purchased before the 6th, they can still come. So there is this question here. He writes this, that he's no friend of Laredo Bru's, he's no friend of a number of people in the cabinet. He writes this, and there's enough uncertainty there from the outset that on the 13th of May, the ship sails with 937 people on board. Okay? So there's already a question mark at the beginning as to whether this is going to happen, but it's not until the 24th that it becomes clearer that these passengers may not get off even though they have purchased these tourist landing permits. So those are kind of the three major players. Laredo Bru always has to be looking over his shoulder for Batista. Batista can, most often can take him down if he wants to. But by this point, Laredo Bru realizes that he's probably in the driver's seat on this because there's enough of an upswell of anti-Semitism. There's enough hostility that seems to be in the air that letting this ship in could probably damage him, and not letting it in is going to come back to his benefit. So Batista suddenly gets influenza, and he doesn't play a role in this. The whole time the ship is there. Now, whether he had influenza or not, I don't know, but in any case, he's not there. So Berenson comes over, cocksure that he can solve this, but the real person that has helped him all along is not going to play a role. It's Batista. Okay? He doesn't open his mouth about this over the next several days. This is a wonderful photograph that I came up with. This is Laredo Brew gesturing over something. This over here is Batista. These two men who do not like one another, facing each other. This looks like it's out of a Hollywood movie. You can imagine Peter Lorre walking out or somebody in the background, and it just, it just feels that way. But it's real. So these are the key players on the Cuban side. The key players with respect to the Americans are Court de Bois, who is the Consul General, and Butler Wright, who is the U.S. Ambassador. And they become aware very quickly that there are problems. They don't realize this until it actually happens. They have been reading the press. They have some concern, but they don't know how much concern they need to have at this moment. The most significant thing is that the moment that Lawrence Berenson arrives, and he arrives on the 30th, I believe it is, he basically is constantly telling both Wright and Dubois, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. And so they're writing back to either Sumner Wells or to Cordell Hull at the State Department. Well, there's somebody here representing the Joint Distribution Committee. He's an attorney. He, in fact, had been, as you can see here, he had been the president of the Cuban American Chamber of Commerce. He's had a long-term relationship with Cuba here, and he is convinced he'll be able to work this out. They're not so convinced, but they're willing to follow his lead. So this does not become a crisis as soon as it might, largely because of Lawrence Berenson. And so this goes on. He has a couple of meetings with President Laredo Brew, and both of them go relatively well. But his meeting on the 1st of June, so this is already what, 5 days into, let me see, 28, 29, 30, 31, 1. Okay, we're already 5 days into this. He has a meeting with Laredo Brew, and Laredo Brew says, we need to get some guarantees if we're going to land the passengers. Those passengers, if they land, they're not going to be offloaded in Havana. We're going to pick another place for them. But we cannot continue our conversation with the ship there. The ship is going to have to sail tomorrow. It has to be outside Cuban territorial waters as we continue our negotiations. And so the St. Louis leaves Havana Harbor on the 2nd of June. And many of you know that between the 2nd of June and the 6th of June, it's kind of sailing around in circles in what are called the Florida Straits between Cuba and Florida, waiting for information based on the negotiations that are going on. And Laredo Brew tells him what he wants. Then Berenson works with a couple of other Cubans that are in very high positions, and they work out a document, they present it, and Laredo Brew raises the ante. So Berenson says, we're having a problem, there's going to have to be more money involved in order to offload the passengers. And there's an emergency meeting in New York City of the board of the Joint, and they decide to go ahead and give the money. And at this particular point, Laredo Brew says there was a 48-hour time limit on this, and it has run out. It's run out. And this is basically on the 6th that this happens. And at this point, Captain Schroeder decides we need to head back. We need to head back to Europe. And so let me show you. Cuba opens its doors. This is an article that you can see that was published on the 5th. So this is the way things look on the 4th. The article is published on the following day. That it looks like there's going to be an agreement here, $500 bond for each of the Joint was a remarkable organization. They raised so much money. There were so many problems in the world. Many of you may know that Shanghai was a refuge for lots of Jews from Germany, and it was money from the Joint that went to Shanghai. Some of you may know that in the lead up to Kristallnacht, that there were Jews that were stuck in this no man's land between Poland and Germany that the Germans had tried to kick out of the country because they did not hold German citizenship, but their prior citizenship had been, if it hadn't been Polish, it had been part of the Russian Empire. And they wanted, well, the Joint takes care of these people. Funnels food, funnels clothing, funnels money to make sure this was an amazing organization. It's also an amazing place to do research in New York City. So much of the information that I found was in their archives there. So that's the way it looks, and then the very next day in the New York Times, Cuba has changed their mind. Okay, so it's the 6th of June when this finally gets to Roosevelt's desk. He has stayed out of this, and the reason he stayed out of this, and the reason that Cordell Hull and Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, have stayed out of it, is because the reports that they're getting from Butler Wright and from Cote d'Ivoire are everything seems to be in hand. Lawrence Berenson is convinced that he can make this work. Okay. And so days go by in which he's living in Never Never Land. And he finally calls Cote d'Ivoire, and he says, and he's completely changed. He's like a man at the end of his tether. He realizes that he's failed, that he misjudged the situation. He asks Cote d'Ivoire, do you think I should try to reach Batista? And both Cote d'Ivoire and Butler Wright tell him there is an offer, and there was an offer from Santo Domingo, from the Dominican Republic, to bring the Jews there. And so that word actually gets back to New York, and they debate that. On the 7th of June, they debate, should we take the Dominican Republic up on their offer? But when you read the document, they learn, the guy who is the executive director, his name is Hyman, realizes that the Dominican Republic is requiring a $500 fee for people to get off the ship, but only if they're Jewish. And this really turns the stomach of the Joint, and they decide, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. So they begin this effort then. Here's the rest of that. I should have put that up. They begin this effort then. How can we make things work with Europe? You know, we don't want this ship to go back to Hamburg. So it starts its journey back on the 6th, and this incredible effort is going on. Now, one of the products of the Avian Conference was the creation of what was called the Intergovernmental Refugee Committee. It's a product of that conference. And there is a chair, his name is Maxwell, can't remember his last name, but the vice chair is Robert Pell. And Robert Pell is assigned by the State Department to be in London doing work. Now, also the chairman of the Joint Distribution Committee has been a member of President Roosevelt's Refugee Committee, and he is over there as well in conversation. So there's already a group in London at this time that has nothing to do with the St. Louis, that suddenly has this dropped in their laps. And it drops in their laps, and they're there at the right particular time. And so Hyman writes or telegraphs to Beerwald, Paul Beerwald, and says, whatever you can do, if you can work with the British government, if there's anything that you can do to bring refugees off this ship into Britain, we will guarantee that they will not become public charges, which is a very big thing. I mean, we associate that with the United States. It was something that was a concern to every country, for good reason. And so Beerwald is a Jew. He's a member of the Joint. He's a very significant man, but he's not a diplomat. Robert Pell is. And these two people start to work together. And Robert Pell has a weekend meeting with a fellow by the name of Lord Winterton. He's a conservative minister of parliament who has a big in with the government. And they spend a weekend together, and while they're there, Beerwald receives a guarantee of the passengers on the St. Louis. He sends that to Pell. Pell shows it to Winterton. Winterton, they were going to spend more than a weekend there. Winterton cuts short his vacation, and he goes back to London, and he meets with the Home Secretary. And a decision is made in this meeting on Monday the 12th that England will take 300 of the passengers if France will do something similar. And Robert Pell then starts working with the diplomatic corps of Belgium, Holland, France, Luxembourg as well. Luxembourg falls by the wayside on this. And the decision is ultimately made then, begins on the 12th, and it happens over the next 2 days. And by the 14th, a decision has been reached that the passengers are going to be able to be offloaded. And they'll be offloaded in Belgium, in Antwerp. I saw a bit of a problem in the exhibit here. It suggests that all of the passengers, only the passengers that were going to be in Belgium were offloaded, but in fact, the whole ship is offloaded in Belgium, and then they are divided up between the 4 countries. Some are taken to England, some are taken to France, some are taken to Holland, and then some of them do in fact stay in Belgium at this point. But that's the decision that is reached. And that word gets to the ship on the 14th or the 15th, I think it's the 14th that it gets to the ship. There are 907 passengers on the ship. Remember that you had the 28 that got off. There were 30 total that aren't here. One of them dies. He gets on the ship with congestive heart failure, and he dies just a few days into the voyage. Has nothing to do with the information. He's a dying man at that point. Another one, however, gets so desperate because he'd been in a concentration camp that he slit his wrists and he jumps overboard in Havana Harbor. He's rescued in critical condition. He's taken to hospital, and he ends up in England. So that's the word there. And then this telegram comes from Morris Troper. Morris Troper is the one who he's in charge of all refugee issues for the Joint in Europe. He plays an incredible role in this, working with Robert Pell, working with Paul Beerwald. But he's the man on the scene. He's the man that you see in the pictures. He is the front here. And so, as you can see, the decision has been made to distribute these passengers here. When the ship arrives in Flushing, Flushing is when Morris Troper and other delegates from the other countries get on the ship. And at that particular point, there were 200 children on the ship, and they line up on either side, and they basically bless Morris Troper for what he's done. It's an incredible story. And this picture shows the children looking up at Morris Troper here. This is before they got off the ship in Antwerp, Belgium. Obviously, this is a happy occasion. That's part of the story I want to get across here. This is a happy occasion. There's a New York Times correspondent who was there, and he writes a piece that I find very interesting. He says, I have not seen passengers get off a ship who are refugees that look so happy, so content. I saw people coming across the Spanish border escaping from Franco, and they were desperate looking people. We have to remember this was a very complicated world in 1939. The opposition to Franco basically ends in January of 1939. That civil war had been going on since 1936. There are lots of refugees from Franco's Spain, two or four of whom got off the ship in Havana. So this is what they look like. The little girl in front is Lisa Joseph, and she was the daughter of the person who was kind of the chair of the passenger committee. Joseph, that's kind of a difficult one. It's like Major in, what was the name of that? Catch 22, right, okay, thank you. So she writes this piece. We, the children of the St. Louis, wish to express to you, and through you, the American Joint Distribution Committee, our deep thanks from the bottom of our hearts for having saved us from a great misery. We pray that God's blessing be upon you. We regret exceedingly that flowers did not grow on the ship. Otherwise, we would have presented you with a bouquet. Robert Pell is never mentioned, and the State Department doesn't want him to be mentioned. This is something that they're happy that the Joint Distribution Committee is in front on. But a lot of this would not have happened without a skilled diplomat basically ironing out the way for him to have these conversations with these other countries and making this work. So this is the ship as it comes in to Antwerp on the 17th before they get off. And both of these pictures, by the way, are at the library, along with quite a number of other ships. So this is the outcome here. You have 931 Jewish passengers on the ship. 22 of them disembark because they had proper visas at this point. Of the 907 passengers, these are how they were divided up between the four countries. Okay? And at this particular point, keep in mind, this is June, the war doesn't break out until September, and the invasion of Western Europe doesn't occur until May of the following year. Okay? Those that got to the continent, I mean, the story was often told, you know, before this book was written, that if you ended up in the continent, you didn't survive. Now, I'm not saying this is a good story, but it's better than the story as it's been presented. And basically, half the ship ends up immigrating to America. You know, I cannot tell you how many children or grandchildren. I know one very well in Keene, whose father was on the St. Louis. I can't tell you how many I have met, which tells you that a lot of them got here. A lot of them got here. Not on the St. Louis, but they got here. This is out of this book by these two scholars at the Holocaust Museum, Refuge Denied. This is a tricky story. This is one of these things, you know, in Holocaust studies, there are a few things that we often talk about that result in heated debate. One of them is, you know, why wasn't Auschwitz bombed? And you know, that goes back and forth, and there have been conferences focused on that issue. There have been books written on it. This receives a great deal of attention as well. But I always feel that it receives attention without knowing the day-to-day process of what was happening here. And some of the arguments, one of the arguments is why didn't the Roosevelt administration put more pressure on the Cubans to take these? You know, we had often strong-armed Latin America for one reason or another. Well, this was a period that was called the good neighbor policy period. That begins in 33 largely, and Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, was very wedded to that. And we had made progress over the last 6 years. There was more cooperation, there was more respect for the United States at this point. All it took was a little twist, and you could have destroyed a lot of the effort. And at this point, that could be dangerous because the Nazis were making inroads in Latin America. And there was a lot of fear about that. Now, the other argument that's often made is, well, why didn't he just let the passengers land in the United States? You know, he had the power to do this. We have the quota system. You know, it could have been just subtracted from the quota. Okay, this would have been a headache. Okay, the problem is, I just like to read this one piece out of my article. Congressional opposition aside, and Congress at this point. Now, keep in mind, as the ship was going around in circles, there were congressional hearings at that time, that very time, on the Wagner-Rogers bill. It was the third set of congressional hearings to bring in refugee children outside of the quota. And so, muddying the water with this at a time that was so significant could have been a problem for that. Now, that failed anyhow, though. It failed anyhow. Okay, congressional opposition aside, what if, as chief executive, Roosevelt had ordered disembarkation in the U.S., subtracting the 907 total from Germany's existing quota? Theoretically, one might argue there was no need to violate the immigration laws, since the United States was, at that time, allowing entry for as many as 27,370 Germans each year. By the way, they're not called Jews. We did not, we basically, we treated somebody as the nationality from the country they came from. It didn't matter, and of course, this is not the way the Nazis thought, but it didn't matter if they were Catholic, Protestant, or Jewish, okay? The Nazis don't view what being Jewish is through a religious lens. They viewed it through a racial lens. But in any case, just to let you know that when I say Germans, I'm not talking about anybody with a German passport. But this hypothetical raises a troubling question. At what cost would such action have been taken? Who, scheduled for a later voyage to New York, would have been ensnared in Germany? The proposal unwittingly disregards the 907 quota immigrants displaced by such a decision, individuals who, given their low quota numbers, were preparing to leave Germany. According to the popular historian Mark Aronson, Roosevelt knew that if he let the passengers of the St. Louis into America, others who had already been told they could come would be shut out. If that exchange had taken place, my mother might very well have been trapped in Europe and sent to her death. So there was too much, history's complicated. History's complicated. Okay. So I'd like to give you that and take whatever questions that you might have for this difficult problem. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Question way back in the next to the last row, I think. Yes?
So the American tourist pass, what would the modern day equivalent of that be, if there is one?
The modern day equivalent of what?
The tourist pass.
Oh, geez. We actually, interestingly, the question was, what is the modern day equivalent, if there is one, for the tourist landing permit? I don't know of anything that's quite like that, although I'll have to say I have a colleague right now who I'm sharing an office with at Keene State College who's from Sarajevo. He is a Bosniak, which means that he is in fact a Bosnian Muslim. And he's over in a position that we call a global fellow. It's a project that we just started this year, and every fall we're going to have a similar person. You might say that the visa that he has to come into the country, because it has like a 4-month piece to it, might be somewhat similar. Though I would suggest that these tourist landing permits, they didn't seem to have that kind of a chronological, parameter on it. Now, what's interesting is after Kristallnacht in November of 1938, this is looking at America now, Roosevelt said, we have several thousand, and in fact we had maybe somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 to 10,000 people who were over here visiting. They might be in school, they might be studying in this country. Many of them were Jews. And he made a decision that they were going to extend their visiting passes as long as necessary. He took a lot of heat from that from Congress, who said that he was circumventing the immigration laws doing that. So the United States, at least under Roosevelt, this was something that was recommended to him by Francis Perkins, who was his Secretary of Labor at the time. I think we can do this and legally get away with it, but it's going to create some political havoc for you. I can't tell you any more than what I just told you. Next semester, I'm going to be teaching in Poland at Jagiellonian, and you can go to Poland for 90 days without a visa. Beyond that, I have to go down to New York to the consulate to get an extension on that, to get a full-fledged visa. So there are these kinds of possibilities for people, but that's not a tourist landing permit. I don't know what the equivalent of that might be. So, yeah, good question. Yeah, here.
Professor Vincent, your presentation is a microcosm of the kind of refugees in the country for whatever reason back in 1939. Can you draw a parallel or a lesson dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis of recent years?
Yeah, the question was, your presentation is a microcosm of the refugee crisis as it was in 1939. Can you draw any parallel to the refugee crisis, which is contemporaneous with us today? You know what's fascinating about that question is it's like you can flip things on their head. Who has taken the refugees? A million. Germany. 1 million refugees. My God, that's a lot. When we had the highest immigration in this country in the first decade of the 20th century, there were 2 years in which immigration went over 1 million. I think it was 1906 and 1908 or something like that. And obviously, we decided that was way too many. Well, Germany's a much smaller country. Germany is about the size of Montana, and they're obviously, Angela Merkel is paying a price for that right now. The German political system is as well. Our country, I don't know who's in my audience, but to me, my country is an embarrassment right now. Not everybody is clapping their hands. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. It just, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. You know, I'm a member of Keene Rotary Club, and I took my office mate that I just mentioned to you to speak at Rotary about his experience, the research he's doing about Bosnia in the 1990s. He was a boy of 4 years old when the genocide happens. And he's lucky. He's lucky to be alive. His parents are lucky to be alive. And to have him at Rotary and to introduce him to my fellow Rotarians as a Muslim, that I found very important. You know, this guy's a Muslim. He doesn't frighten me. He seems like an awfully nice guy. And I wish we had more of that. You know, the knee-jerk response to what happened in New York, as horrific as that was, it so troubles me. How about all of the other people who have come in a similar fashion and are not doing what this fellow did? Are we going to put the weight of this whole group on the shoulders of this one man? You know, obviously we're not going to do that with respect to guns and what happened in Las Vegas a few weeks ago. I feel a lot of hypocrisy, but I also feel a terrific amount of racism, as well as antipathy towards Muslims, which I went through a period where I was frightened, but that's been years ago now. I grew out of it. I can't answer your question. I can basically, I know our history, and I know our history has incredible flaws in it. I've mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act. You know, once the Transcontinental Railroad was built and we had all these Chinese that came into our country in the 60s and 70s and did that, we didn't need them anymore. And we suddenly got frightened by them. It's the first time in our history when we excluded people because of who they were and where they came from. Wouldn't be the last. And we're doing the same kind of thing now. So I have serious problems with it. You know, I have a picture of Hubert Humphrey and Lyndon Baines Johnson and a group on Ellis Island signing a bill which ended the quota system in 1965, and it's such an incredibly positive statement that they make. And I just feel like, as many of us who grew up in the city, I was in college between 65 and 69. I felt a whole new wonderful world was opening up, and it's very difficult for me to grasp how we suddenly have gone in a different direction. The world is much different now in our country than the world I grew up in. You know, I remember being in a class in Seattle where there was one Oriental girl in the class, and she really stood out. She was so different than the rest of us. And now it's, you know, one of the reasons I love New York City, it's like you're in a United Nations there. You know, you get on a subway, or even you walk through Central Park and you hear so many languages, and that's the way the world should be, I think. And I just think right now, what we do is so based on fear, and people don't even know what they're fearing. It's an emotional thing. But fear results in prejudice, and then it results in exclusion. And I do my best. You know, I teach. Thank you. It was, yes. Yes.
Once the countries decided, you know, to take us out of Belgium or take us out of something like that, how did they actually divide people to go to those different?
Okay, the question was, once they figured out that these four countries were going to take all of the passengers, how did they divide them? I can't answer that. I know the numbers. I don't know how they sat down and decided, if I could flip back that slide, that you know, Holland would have this many, Belgium. I don't know how they did that. I do know my friend in Keene, his family were offloaded and they were going to be in Belgium. And they decided they didn't want to be in Belgium and they went to France. No. And apparently, you know, once this was done, it was not a final thing. You know, you weren't imprisoned where you went. You could go someplace else. And probably that move to France may in fact have saved their lives. I don't know, because Belgium falls much faster than France does. And you have other means of getting out when the country is divided between occupied France and Vichy France, and you're closer to the Pyrenees and you're closer to the possibility of getting into Spain and then maybe to Portugal. And I know many people who got to this country from Portugal ultimately during the war. But how they came up with the numbers, I mean, I pointed out that at least initially on the 12th of June, there was a statement that Britain would take 300. if France would also take. And there was another point, by the way, before this, when the French made an offer to take the children and to put, I think, about 150 of the adults in Morocco, because remember, France was a colonial power and had the possibility of using North Africa. Now that was changed, but that was a conversation earlier on during this voyage back from Europe. That was decided to be set aside, I think, once Britain said they were willing to do something. Now, let me point out something. This was not necessarily through the goodness of their hearts that the British did this. The British were starting to close off Jewish refugees going to Palestine. This was becoming a problem. And, you know, one of the reasons that the kinder transport happens, and one of the reasons that they respond more positively to this, is that they knew that they were probably taking a black eye because they were closing immigration to Palestine, largely because the more astute there saw a war on the horizon, and they needed that Middle Eastern oil, or they were not going to be able to get the Royal Navy off the ground. So this is a pragmatic issue with a potential war on the horizon that I think to some degree suggests why the British are responding positively here. Keeping in mind that the Joint also had guaranteed every one of these people. They knew if these people did not have quota numbers, I don't think this would have happened. That has to be kept in mind. The reason that this works is so many of them have quota numbers, which means that they have gone through the process, they've got the affidavits, they know that they're going to get into America at such and such a time once their quota number comes up. And I don't know that this would have happened if the British would have said, well, you know, you're going to be here for the next 15 years. No, that's not going to work. I'm sorry, you can't come. You can't come. I know that's a bit of an answer, but not exactly. Okay, yes. Yes, please.
I'm a first-generation American child of Holocaust refugees. And part of our family's historic lore is that my grandparents and mother had to get a sponsor in the United States.
Yeah.
And we have all that correspondence.
That's the affidavit.
So that's the I wanted to know where that fit in the equation.
Yeah. It was assurance that you would not become a public charge. Okay. I mean, especially in those early years of the Roosevelt administration, well, actually this begins quite clearly in the Hoover administration, our unemployment was astronomical. It was over 30%. And you don't bring a lot of refugees into it, you don't bring immigrants into a country when you have that many. And this is not an excuse that we have today, by the way. It was an excuse that we had in the 30s that, now most people will say, and I think many people say now, that the fact of the matter is when you bring refugees into a country, they end up creating more jobs than you end up losing. And there were people that were arguing that then, but nobody wanted to listen to them. I mean, you only hear what you want to hear. That's just human nature. You only hear what you want to hear, okay? Yeah, right behind you, yes.
I read a book that said that the reason we did not bring in that boatload of Jews was because there was so much anti-Semitism in the government. So, I mean, I don't think we were so great not to bring in because they all went back and they were killed.
Well, no, they weren't. I just shown that.
Excuse me, if they went back to Holland and Belgium and France, they didn't make it.
Now let's put this in historical context. You know why they're smiling on that ship? You know why they're happy?
Because they don't know.
The war has not started. Remember what I said before, none of us know what's going to happen tomorrow. None of us know what's going to... This was a success, and it was a success that the American government was involved in. And these people did have quota numbers, and many of them came to this country. This is not to deny that there wasn't anti-Semitism in the country, and there was in fact significant anti-Semitism amongst some of those that were in the State Department. But by the same token, Breckinridge Long, who has a terrible reputation as one of the assistant secretaries of state, when he was approached by the Spaniards saying, could we bring Spaniards into the country, he said, go to Mexico. Breckinridge Long did not discriminate in terms of the people he wanted or didn't want in the. He didn't want any Europeans coming in the country. I have read through his diary, and I am convinced that this man was frightened. He had been the ambassador to fascist Italy under Mussolini. He got sick there. He couldn't eat. He had to be brought home. He was scared to death. And at that point, this was the wrong person to be put in charge of immigration in the State Department. There was no way, as a European, that you were going to get in. By the way, the Spanish quota was in the triple figures, not the many figures. You know, we think of ourselves as having a very Hispanic, a large Hispanic population. We need to remember that that Hispanic population comes from Latin America. We have very few actual Spaniards living in this country. And so when you looked at the 1890 census, or you looked at the 1920 census, you found very, very few Spaniards. But Breckinridge, Cordell Hull was married to a Jew. He's the Secretary of State. He didn't make a point of telling people my wife's Jewish. Because he knew, and I can name a couple of the people who were in reasonably high positions who were clearly anti-Semitic. There was a lot of anti-Semitism in the country. If you go back and you read the want ads in newspapers in the 1930s, you will see statements that Catholics and Hebrews need not apply. Okay? You couldn't get away with that now, but then, you know, then that was something that that was accepted. You know, there was a quota system to get into Harvard. There was a quota system to get into Yale, and you're not going to be a member of a country club. By the same token, New York had the second largest population of Jews in the world in the 1930s. Still does. Still does. So you cannot have a black and white statement about these things. History is much more complicated than that. Could more have been done? Yes. But in June of 1939, Roosevelt called the leadership of the Senate and the House together in July of 1939 to the White House, and he said, I need you to lift the embargo on selling goods to France and Britain. The neutrality laws were preventing him from getting materials to those two countries. William Borah, who was the senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee, senator from Idaho, said, I don't care what you say, I have better sources than your State Department, there's not going to be a war. In 6 weeks there was a war. In 6 weeks there was a war. That's what Roosevelt was fighting. There was a major issue here that we cannot fail to take into account, and that is there is a major war on the horizon. Our country was pitifully prepared. In 1939, we had the 18th or 19th largest army in the world. Poland had a larger army. Belgium had a larger army. We were not ready to go to war. Soldiers, when they were called up, they were training with sticks instead of rifles. Roosevelt was scared to death of Hitler. The Holocaust hadn't happened. Nobody had heard of Auschwitz. Didn't exist. In fact, it was still called Auschwitz. And that's why those passengers are so delighted. Okay? Yes, please.
Does this episode have a legacy of immigration patterns that occurred in the ensuing 2 or 3 years in the
Of the war?
That be a lot of decision making in terms of all these parties involved, dealing with immigrants, governments.
Things don't happen immediately. In fact, when I pointed out that it takes until 1965 for the quota system to basically be put to sleep, you need to note that between 1945 and that point, we're still having very serious problems. In the war itself, there was great pressure to remove the Chinese Exclusion Act. This Chinese Exclusion Act was still in place in the Second World War. Now, because Roosevelt considers Chiang Kai-shek as an ally, and he wants him to be an equal ally, how can you be telling Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese that they're not allowed in our country? And so they had to deal with that. They actually created a quota for China. It was minuscule. But it's like the camel getting their nose under the tent. It starts something. At least it starts something, okay? So we've got problems with a lot of ethnicities and races in this country. You know, I mentioned Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic. You know, what turns the joint off with them? They want to do something different with Jews simply because they're Jews. They're going to charge them. And, you know, you probably know that, what was his name? The Voyage, yeah. He wants to make, you know, Haitian can be black. The Dominican Republic is going to be white. And so there was incredible mass slaughter of blacks in his side of the island. And one of the reasons that he was interested in Jews, they might not be quite right, but they're better than black. I mean, you know, it's pretty ugly stuff down there too. So a lot of parts of Latin America are not. Yeah. Last question. Last question.
Not just a question, but sometimes our prejudices have nothing to do with immigration.
Absolutely.
The Intermountain Jewish Weekly, for which I have written for several years, recently took Senator Dianne Feinstein of California to task. The IJW covers about 7 western states. Senator Feinstein actually testified she could not support someone who was being interviewed for a job in our government because she was Catholic and she did not feel she could be a good public servant. It was like a return to 1928.
Exactly. Exactly. Or even 1960 in John F. Kennedy.
Yeah. Beautifully said, Diane, we don't judge people this way.
And she knows better.
Yes, she does know better.
She knows better.
She should know better.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. No, thank you for that comment. The comment. Nobody heard it? Okay. This has not necessarily anything to do just with, well, immigration is important. You're not denying me immigration is important, but you write for a periodical, the Intermountain Jewish Weekly, okay.
In Denver.
And one of the articles took issue with Dianne Feinstein, who was opposed to hiring somebody for a position because they were Catholic. Yeah. And that's like throwing everything back 90 years to where we were. And my response to that is Dianne Feinstein should know better. Anyhow, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it.